Buenos días a todos. Sean bienvenidos. Soy Elisa Montalvo y estaré moderando la cátedra magistral de Herscher de la Universidad de Michigan. Su cátedra lleva por título The Global Shelter Imaginary. Y pues primero que nada me gustaría agradecer al comité por darme la oportunidad. Para mí es un honor estar aquí hoy con ustedes. Good morning, everyone. Welcome. I am Elisa Montalvo and I will moderate Herscher lecture from the University of Michigan entitled The Global Shelter Imaginary. And first of all, I would like to thank the committee for giving me the opportunity. For me, it's an honor to be here with you today. And to introduce our special guest, I will share a bit of his bio. Herscher's work endeavors to bring the study of architecture and cities to bear on struggles for rights, justice, and democracy across a range of global sites. In his scholarship, he explores the architecture of political violence, migration and displacement, and self-determination and resistance. His books include Violence Taking Place, The Architecture of the Kosovo Conflict, Stanford University Press, 2010, The Unreal State Guide to Detroit, University of Michigan Press, 2012, Displacement, Architecture and Refugee, Stenberg Press, 2017, Spatial Violence, Routledge, 2016, co-edited with Anura Iver-Sidki, and The Global Shelter Imaginary, IKEA, Humanitarianism and Rightless Relief, University of Minnesota Press, forthcoming. Co-authored with Daniel Bertrand Monk, and he has also co-founded a series of militant research collaboratives, including the We the People of Detroit Community Research Collective, Detroit Resist, and the Shelter Colonial City Project. He is currently an associate professor at the University of Michigan in Architecture, Art History, and Slavic Languages and Literatures. And he also co-directs the interdisciplinary faculty graduate seminar, Decolonizing Pedagogies. And without further ado, I give the floor to our special guest. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you, Elisa. I'm very happy to be here with you, wherever we are. I wish we could all be meeting in person. I'm also very honored to have this opportunity to share my work with you. Let me try to share my screen. Okay. The work that I'd like to share with you today explores architecture's engagement with humanitarianism, and in particular with humanitarian issues around displacement and migration. The consequences of that engagement is what I call the global shelter imaginary, and this comes, as Elisa mentioned, from a book that I co-authored with Dan Monk. And in what follows, I'm going to say more about the history of this global shelter imaginary and what this imaginary is and what it does. Before I begin, though, I want to underscore that my work has focused on issues around displacement in the European context, not the American context. I started to study architecture's engagement with humanitarianism during the so-called refugee crisis in Europe that began in 2014 and of course still continues today. I wanted to know what the architectural history of that crisis was, and I ended up writing a version of that history myself in the book that you see here. I don't know if a focus on parallel issues in the American context would yield a similar understanding of the global shelter imaginary, but I would note that the US government's current Remain in Mexico policy is not only violent, inhumane, and in violation of US treaty obligations, this policy also brings the United States in alignment with European Union policy that allows EU member states to deport asylum seekers to the first EU state that they entered. In other words, the violence and inhumanity of the refugee and migration regime is not isolated to the United States. It's now common across the global north. I imagine that some, or maybe many of you, are dealing with questions of displacement across the US-Mexico border in your own life and in your own work. And my hope is that we can talk about the shelter imaginaries that you are all contending with in the discussion that will follow my contribution. The intersection of architecture and humanitarianism is now very familiar. In many places and many situations, it seems like it's almost impossible to talk about one without talking about the other. And this is talk that often includes discussions of latest innovations or best practices or lessons learned or new problems to solve. But by contrast, the discussion of architecture's relationship to humanitarianism almost never inspires reflection, I would say, on the political paradoxes and contradictions of that relationship. And so in what follows, I'd like to turn towards those paradoxes and contradictions, and I'd like to ask this question: with the interests of displaced people, and these people now account for around 1 out of every 115 people on the planet, would the interests of these people be better served if architecture stopped trying to serve them, at least in the ways that architecture has been serving them throughout the 20th century and into the present? What you're looking at here is an image of a recent, highly celebrated and increasingly utilized outcome of the intersection of architecture and humanitarianism. This is a product called the Better Shelter. It's the product of a partnership between the planet's biggest refugee landlord, this is the United Nations High Commission on Refugees, and the planet's biggest provider of home furnishings, this is IKEA. The ambition of the Better Shelter is to transform the landscape of humanitarianism by building upon IKEA's successes with flat pack design to create a new sort of universal post-emergency shelter. So this Better Shelter arrives on site in the 2 boxes that you see here. These boxes contain pipe frames, they contain connectors, the plastic panels that are the exterior of the shelter. And with the exception of an anchoring system that requires the use of tools, each Better Shelter is held together with pressure fittings that can be tightened by hand. The creators of the Better Shelter emphasize that this product can't compete with the standard tent as an emergency shelter. It can't compete with the tent in terms of cost or utility, nor can the Better Shelter serve the purpose of resettlement, which of course requires infrastructure, which requires architecture, and most of all, it requires political rights. And this is a point that becomes blurry when the Better Shelter is described as the kind of housing, as you see it is here, and here, and in many other places besides. What the Better Shelter actually is, according to its creators, is a response to protracted conditions of displacement. It's a response that is intended to bridge the gap between, on the one hand, emergency shelters, and on the other hand, durable solutions or houses. So tents are designed to last only a few months, but the Better Shelter is designed to last up to 3 years. And with its lockable doors, its windows, and its semi-solid walls, the Better Shelter is designed to resemble a house, and in the words of its creators, allow residents a higher level of security. Tent. But I want to say that the continuum that spans from tents to houses does not index duration and does not index security, but rather it is a series of moments in what I would call a juridico-political paradox. And this is a paradox that defines protracted crises of displacement to begin with. What is this paradox? The displaced cannot be naturalized as citizens of the state where they find refuge, but they can't be repatriated to the states where they fled. So the better shelter and the shelter imaginary it emerges from provides a kind of symbolic resolution to this paradox. This resolution swaps recognition of the rights of displaced for the provision of rightless relief in the form of a shelter. And this swap, of course, involves architects. It takes well-meaning attempts to architect better living conditions for displaced people and turns these attempts into substitutes for the recognition of the rights of displaced people. So ultimately then, this is a swap of architect for rights. And this swap is a history. It's part of a history of projects to resolve the paradox that dispossessed people present to sovereign states in a biopolitics. In other words, a politics of managing life without rights. And this is a history that was already becoming visible to people like Hannah Arendt in the years after World War II. So Arendt, writing in 1901, with the origins of totalitarianism, pointed to the status of the refugee camp as what she called a practical substitute for the refugees' non-existent homeland. These are her words. All discussions about the refugee problems revolved around this one question: how can the refugee be made deportable again? The Second World War and the displaced person camps were not necessary to show that the only practical substitute for a non-existent homeland was an internment camp. Indeed, as early as the 30s, this was the only country the world had to offer the stateless. Now, Hannah Arendt wrote this in the form of a critique. But now, 60 years later, the country of encampment does not solicit critique as much as a kind of promotional literature, especially within architecture. In the global archipelago of spaces where displaced people are contained and managed, a global shelter imaginary normalizes the given compendium of shelter solutions. And here I'm referring to the array of design prototypes that come to constitute a kind of self-referential and self-evident totality, a kind of universal image of relief that you see displayed and documented in books like these. This imaginary idealizes the country of encampment, and it idealizes the bare life that takes place there as a moral territory, a place in which capital and design expertise can be redistributed to the supposed benefits of the people that Frantz Fanon famously called the wretched of the earth. In so doing, the global shelter imaginary has transformed encampment from what Arendt called practical, in other words, a kind of ad hoc attempt to manage the human remainder resulting from the state's paradoxical relationship to stateless people. It turns it into an ideal. The so-called right to shelter that underscores this imaginary has thereby become, and this is central to my argument, a compensation for, rather than a complement to, the rights accorded to humans and citizens alike. And so it's rightless people, people whose rights are not recognized, for whom a right to shelter is asserted and defended and advanced in the contemporary global shelter imaginary. And the shelter that emerges from this imaginary absorbs stateless people in a form that's now celebrated as moral rather than critiqued as biopolitical. The distinction between moral perspectives, these are perspectives that celebrate the global shelter imaginary, and biopolitical perspectives, these are perspectives that critique that imaginary, are very important to hold on to. But precisely the distinction between the moral and the biopolitical has been blurred in histories of the camp, some recent examples of which you are looking at here. These histories are animated by attempts to globalize the history of the camp, and in so doing, I would argue, these histories have obscured what I take to be a crucial distinction between refugee camps that emerged in European colonies for subjects of those colonies and refugee camps within European states for stateless people. These camps emerged from two different shelter imaginaries. One was a colonial imaginary, an imaginary oriented around militarized internment, and then the other, a humanitarian imaginary oriented around moralized domesticity. But blurring these two imaginaries, globalizations of the camp's history have pointed to formal relationships between colonial era camps in places like Cuba and India and South Africa and Latin America, and subsequent refugee camps, internment camps, and concentration camps in Europe. And these formal relationships are premised on things like carceral enclosure, the use of the barrack, castramented plants, and other features. So running across these two distinctively different shelter imaginaries, these formal relationships turn away from the crisis of statelessness as a crisis of state sovereignty, which is what Hannah Arendt pointed to, and subsequently people like the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben have pointed to. It turns away from that crisis towards an acceptance of a kind of biopolitical formation of that crisis. And so, while the focus or the origin point of virtually all histories of the camp thus far has been the colonial laboratory of internment, this laboratory has yet to be distinguished from the metropolitan laboratory of legitimizing internment that these histories have ignored. And it is this metropolitan laboratory that has yielded a propaganda of rightless relief, whose latest manifestation, I would argue, is the better shelter. Still more, it is in Europe's metropolitan laboratory of internment that shelter has always already been better shelter. What do I mean? Let me begin in Europe's late 19th and early 20th century colonies in places like India. In these colonies, camps for dispossessed or displaced colonized people were typically described and designed in military terms as a species of campsite or bivouac for armed forces. And as such, the camp mediated the status of the territory it emerged in as governed by the laws of war rather than by the state's rule of law. The first camps that were made for people explicitly categorized as refugees began to be constructed in 1899 by the British military in South Africa. And these camps were built for both Boer refugees and indigenous African refugees. The people that were placed in these camps, according to the British anyway, were placed in a way that conformed to the policy of internment that was stipulated in the recently framed Hague Conventions around the rules of war. At the same time, though, the castrumentation of the camp plan, the use of tents for shelter, and the management of refugees as civilian prisoners of war testified to the military imaginary of these camps. Now, received histories of the camp tend to move from these South African examples to camps in Europe built during the First World War. But as it emerged in European contexts during the First World War, the refugee camp was not described in military terms. It was not designed in military terms, but rather in domestic terms. And this is a very important shift, because this transfigured the space of internment into a response to what was called in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in Europe into a response to the housing question. And so it's these European camps, and you're looking at one in Gmund in Austria, built for refugees during World War I. It's these camps, rather than their colonial counterparts, that inaugurate the genealogy that leads to the better shelter. In this genealogy, the better shelter does not represent an attempt to improve refugee shelter, which is what its authors claim. Rather, this entire genealogy is itself a sequence of better refugee shelters and better refugee camps for better refugees. And so, World War I era refugee camps in Europe were insistently designed as a kind of housing, so that the plan of this camp in Gmund resembles any number of contemporary garden suburbs in Europe. Here, in other words, housing represented the form in which the idealization of internment took place. And this is an idealization that was fully lacking in internment's colonial antecedents. In those colonial antecedents, states were contending with people displaced from their homelands. But in Europe, during and after the First World War, states were contending with people from what Hannah Arendt so aptly termed non-existent homelands. And as housing, the camp emerged as a kind of architectural technology to manage that task, and even more profoundly, to manage that task's impossibility. So camps in Europe that appear as outliers in the camp histories, if they even appear at all, are central in the genealogy that leads to the better shelter. So during World War I in Austro-Hungary, for example, the wooden barracks in this refugee camp in Gmund were replaced by the villa barracks that you see on the right, each of which had its own garden. Or in another refugee camp, this one in Oberhollabrunn, this camp was designed as a kind of garden city, and you can see from the plan that the barracks were picturesquely arrayed along the topographical lines of a steep hillside, very much as they would be in a garden city. These and many other examples of refugee camps designed according to contemporaneous housing models, I think emphatically testify to the imaginary of the camp as a form of housing. And what's crucial to note is that these camps were not intended as models. They were themselves modeled on housing. The audience for the campus housing paradigm was not those who inhabited the camps. Rather, it was the society that established these camps, as legitimate spaces to intern people without rights. So modeled as housing, the camp could be assimilated as a kind of non-exceptional space of exception. In The Decline of the Nation State and the Ends of the Rights of Man, which is a chapter in Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism, Arendt described the context within which the camp's legitimizing function developed. These were the years leading up to World War II, when European states realized with shock, Arendt writes, that it was impossible to either get rid of the refugees, this is repatriation, or transform them into nationals of the country of refuge, this is naturalization. And so in World War II, she contended, this problem of statelessness was, in a sense, discursively eliminated by inventing a new term, the term displaced persons, a term that categorized both stateless people and people displaced from states. The imaginary of campus housing continued to develop in Europe during World War II. So in Vichy France, for example, and this followed a precedent established in Nazi-occupied France, camps were built to intern Roma people and other so-called nomads. These included the camp that you see here, Camp de Salière, which was designed to look like a French village. And it was done so to supposedly facilitate the assimilation of Roma people into French society. This assimilation never took place. Roma people were deported from this camp to concentration camps, just as they were from other internment camps. But this doesn't represent the deception of Salière's design, but rather its function. Its function was to legitimize internment. The global shelter imaginary that unfolded after World War II in the context of institutionalized humanitarianism consolidated what I'm calling an exchange of rightless relief in the form of shelter for rights. This consolidation was animated by and accompanied a reorientation of humanitarianism away from temporary emergency responses to short-term crises towards long-term development processes. And this reorientation normalized the evacuation of refugee rights, and at the same time, it normalized the domestication of the refugee camp. Maybe most important in this domestication was the work of architects like Ian Davis and humanitarians like Fred Cuny, both of whom took the camp's relationship to housing as crucial to the design of a successful camp. And so for architect Ian Davis, the camp's received morphology should be avoided in favor of morphologies drawn from local housing configurations. Or for Fred Cuny, the camp should be considered with the same detail as a master plan for a town. What's important for me here is how both of these ambitions yielded an equivocation between the camp on the one hand and housing on the other hand. The political problem that was faced by the people who lived in these camps, the problem of having no space within which they were endowed with rights, was thereby assimilated into design problems faced by inadequately housed and unhoused people of all kinds, from the homeless through slum dwellers to survivors of disasters and communities displaced from their homes by violence. In the 1980s and the 1990s, a global shelter imaginary was institutionalized. And this happened in the context of institutions like the United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees, or UNHCR. You see here two documents that represent some key moments in this institutionalization. The 1982 UNHCR Handbook for Emergencies. This is a handbook that included an entire section on shelter issues. And below that, a report that accompanied the first international workshop on improved shelter response and environment for refugees. This was organized by the UNHCR in 1993. The review of refugee shelter practices in that latter report begins with a kind of seemingly indisputable claim. The claim that durable shelter constitutes one of the basic needs for refugees. No different from other communities, this review continued, refugee housing represents a cultural commodity. It supports a diversity of functional requirements. It is an important economic multiplier. But there's something very important that's overlooked in this equivocation between refugees and others. What's overlooked is the particular rightlessness of refugees. So in this discussion of refugee housing, the political rightlessness of stateless people is displaced by a supposed right to shelter that for refugees is no different from other communities. In the 2 decades since the publication of this review of refugee shelter practices, these practices have become the object of steadily increasing attention and investment. And this has been facilitated by the corporatization of humanitarianism in the wake of the 1999 declaration by the United Nations and global business leaders of what they call a global compact to harness the energy and influence of multinational corporations to act as good corporate citizens. The Better Shelter is but one particularly well-known and celebrated product of the many produced through this alliance between multinational corporations and humanitarian institutions. Here you're looking at the Better Shelter as the centerpiece of the 2016 exhibition, Insecurities, Tracing Displacement and Shelter. This was an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, where the Better Shelter was also included in the museum's permanent collection. And I think this recognition of the global shelter imaginary in the design world is entirely symptomatic. It's a recognition of a purported refugee housing question that substitutes for recognition of the politics of displacement, a politics that yields refugees and other displaced people in the first place. The Better Shelter meets the needs for the activities of basic living, for privacy, security, and familiarity. It is a safe base, offering a sense of peace, identity, and dignity. And though it may be humble, it is somewhere even the most vulnerable people on earth can call a home away from home. This is copy from Better Shelter publicity material, and it's copy that takes the substitution of homelessness for displacement to perhaps its most extreme point, the equivalence of rightless relief in the form of a better shelter in a refugee camp is rendered equivalent to the home of whatever sort inhabited by a citizen of a nation state, a citizen who, of course, is endowed with rights. The conditions of domesticity that this copy points to, privacy, security, familiarity, and along with the supposed emotional consequences of domesticity, peace, identity, dignity, all are reduced here to a kit of parts: locking doors, windows that open, opaque or actually non-transparent walls, and so on. Rendered as such, domesticity becomes self-explanatory. It becomes all-encompassing. When you have a home, you not only have all that you need, but all that you have ever had. The political conditions of displacement is in a home exchange mediated by IKEA, and in so doing, a technocratic pairing of crisis and relief is perpetuated at the expense of any other ways one might analyze the conditions under which displaced people are forced to negotiate the conditions of their existence. The Better Shelter very recently is finding applications in Mexico to accommodate migrants and refugees who have been prevented from crossing the US border or who have been expelled from the US after they've crossed the border to seek asylum. You're looking here at one example of a Better Shelter camp in Matamoros. I think that we might want to consider critiques of the global shelter imaginary that camps like this emerge from. These are critiques that might open up considerations of the rights of displaced people and how we can recognize those rights instead of providing architectural substitutions for them. I would like to end here and say thank you for your attention, and I look forward to hearing any questions or comments or responses that you might have. Thank you.
Elisa, su micrófono.
Gracias. Thank you, Andrew, for this amazing talk. I was saying that this subject is very urgent, and nowadays we are experiencing this issue here in our border since 2018. So this information you share with us, it is very crucial for us in this moment. Well, I have a question here. I'm going to read it for you. It says, what is your opinion on the World Heritage nomination of the refugee camp and how it intersects with the global shelter imaginary? It seems to me that this recognition is contrary to the planning issue of camps and celebrates the self-construction, not institutional process.
I think that nomination I think that nomination parallels the kind of critique that I'm making, because when to nominate a refugee camp as World Heritage is to center the fact that refugee camps persist. They last. They have duration. They're not temporary places as they're explicitly designed to be. So I think that to nominate that camp as World Heritage is a way to critique the kind of politics of the camp as a temporary place to hold people while their political status is negotiated. Because as Hannah Arendt and many others have pointed out, there's a paradox. The paradox is refugees can't get repatriated to the place where they came from, but they have a great difficulty becoming naturalized as citizens in the places where they're going to. And the camp ends up becoming this kind of permanently impermanent place. And the nomination of a camp as heritage, I think, points to that paradox in the way that I'm trying to point to it too.
Okay, very interesting, this situation in this special camp, and thank you for your answer. Well, I will ask you something. From the data of the Unhcr that says that 1 out of 97 persons in the world are experiencing forced displacement, and with this, it's only going to get worse, I assume. Which do you think, or which do you consider will be the best response from the government to deal with this issue, this lack of housing, this lack of integration to the communities? What do you think the government should say about this?
But my point is that there's no architectural solution to this question. It's not a housing question. It's a question of who gets rights, or whose rights are recognized and whose rights are not recognized. I mean, really, open borders. The opening of borders is the only solution. This is the only way that refugees will actually be able to become not refugees. People don't become refugees because they want to be refugees. They want to live somewhere else. And the only way to do that, and architecture can't solve that problem. Architecture can only smooth over the horrible consequences that are happening, that are, I think, more familiar to you where you are than to me where I am. The violent and humane and horrible consequences of people who get stuck because they're stuck in a refugee status because they can't become citizens of the state where they're going to, and they don't want to return to the state that they left. They're stuck, and there's no conceivable architectural solution to that. And I think architects get very, they want to do something about the horror of this catastrophe, but everything that architects do gets caught up in what I call the global shelter imaginary, which gives refugees shelter in exchange for not recognizing their rights. So what's happening in Europe, what's happening on the US-Mexico border, it is violent, it is humane, it is in violation of treaty obligations, and there is no architecture, I would argue anyway, there's no architectural solution to that. So I think, because whatever architects do gets enmeshed in this kind of exchange of rights for rightless relief.
Thank you. I have here another question from Maru. It says, thanks for the excellent reflection. My question, how the shelter imaginary in terms of fear of minorities remind us of our own incomplete idea of state, family, self?
That's a beautiful question. I mean, in a way, it's a question. It's a beautiful question in many ways, but one of the ways is that it includes its own answer. I completely agree. I think it's fear of the other that is motivating, and it's also a fear of states surrendering sovereignty to others, that keeps borders closed, and that produces or animates the global shelter imaginary as a kind of compensation or substitute for those closed borders. So, you know, states don't give access to refugees, to migrants, to displaced people, and what they do give them is shelter, better and otherwise. And I completely agree with Maru that what motivates that swap is a kind of very tightly holding on to the idea of the state as sovereign, as separate, as closed or closable, as if you can close a border. I mean, there's many things that can be said about borders. I mean, and this idea that they can be closed is something that really needs to be, which seems to, I mean, states are doing this all the time. I'm living in a state that has closed a border, but this is something that we should really look closely at and critique.
Thank you, Andrew. I have another question here. Do you think industrial design must work with architectural design for these refugees that in our country become permanent most of the time?
But can you, I didn't quite catch that question. Could you repeat it slower?
Yes, of course. Do you think industrial design must work with architectural design for these refugees that in our country become permanent most of the time?
I think the problem of refugee camps and refugee shelters becoming permanent is not solvable until the only way to solve that problem is to give people the opportunity to not be refugees. Because no one wants to live life as a refugee. And so there's no, this is the kind of heart of the critique I'm trying to make. There's no architectural solution. There's no such thing as a better refugee camp. There's no such thing as a better refugee shelter. There isn't. There's no architectural solution to that. And there's no design solution to that. The solution of that is to recognize people as people who bear rights, so that people who are called refugees are able to pass out of that status and live like citizens. That's really the heart of this critique I'm trying to make, that there is no such thing as a better refugee camp. There's no such, even when they're permanent, and even if they're designed by IKEA, they're not adequate. The only thing that's adequate is to allow people to pass out of refugee status and live like citizens. And I don't know how architecture can participate in that. Does that make sense? I hope so.
Yes, a lot of sense.
I mean, it's a little. I mean, I'm also trained as an architect, and I realize it's a frustrating message to architecture, because architects, we want to think that we can solve the problems that provoke us, but some problems architecture can solve, and I think some problems architecture can't solve. Some problems require political transformation, and I think the argument I'm trying to make here is that there isn't an architectural solution to the problems that displaced people are dealing with.
Yes, you are. Yeah, you say an important point, which is architects can't solve this issue. We may ease the situation while they are without a roof, but it's not permanent solution. And I agree with you when you said this is it needs political transformation because yes.
Yeah, because when architects give people a roof and they give people a better shelter, they take pressure off of the need to politically transform the situation. That's the thing. No matter how beautiful the roof is and how beautiful the walls are and how beautiful the shelter is, if a person is living in that beautiful shelter as a refugee, that person does not have equal rights.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because they are looking not just for a new home in these camps you showed us, but they are looking forward to start their life.
Exactly.
Right?
Yes, they're looking for a new life. Yes,
because their home, it's not giving them those opportunities, those basics rights. So they must leave their home to seek this safety for them and their family. And it's very, I remember this that you wrote in your book of architecture displacement. You said something about crisis, and that really sticks to me, that the crisis is not, it's always there. It only gets this name of crisis when the governments are struggling with all the media, right? So we are experiencing now a crisis here in our city and our border because everyone noticed it. So it gets in all the television ads and the information around the world. Now the problem is for the government to solve, right? To take this pressure, like you said. But what are we responding right now? It's with these shelters here in our city, and they are no guidance to solve the real problem. They are offering a better shelter for them, but there's no clear future for them. Either they cross the border or they stay here in our city.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Thank you for sharing that with me because I realize that you in your city are dealing with a lot of the issues that I'm trying to write about in a different context. The thing I would also add about for whom is it a crisis? It's a crisis for governments, but like in the United States and in Europe, the people who are most threatened by refugees are working class people who fear losing jobs. Refugees that are people who will take our jobs, and as the question that Maru asked, there are also other people who bring other threatening cultures, and it's those people that I think who can't see any kind of solidarity with refugees, can't see any affiliation, alliance, responsibility to refugees, and they provoke governments to do things like close borders and leave us in the current situation when all that's left for refugees are these kind of permanent, impermanent places like camps. And as I said, I don't see architecture being able to offer any future to that. So I think maybe architects should stop trying to solve that problem and start working on opening borders and things like that. And bring all of our creativity and expertise to the design of an open border rather than the design of a better refugee camp.
Well, yeah, absolutely. That would be the best way to address this situation. But it seems to me it's a little bit far away from reality.
But we do a lot of things as architects that are far away from reality, I think. Like, I mean, in a way that the kind of how to say it, you know, I think, I mean, the kind of central ambition of the discipline is to change reality, right? Like that's what architecture changes reality. It builds a new reality. And so if we can think about like building new kinds of houses, new kinds of cities, can't we think of building new kinds of borders too?
Yeah.
I mean, it could be a design problem. It is a design problem.
Yeah, like Kuni said, you were sharing with us about this perception he has from camps, that it should be designed with the detail of a master plan for a town. It could be a solution to think about this. Well, I'm going to read you another comment from Kimberly Sumano. Very interesting presentation. Thank you. My takeaway is the human rights value of your project and the lack of an architectural solution for this humanitarian crisis. My question, does your project include a follow-up of the use of the better shelter? For example, the Matamoros case you showed us, to see if at the end it is fulfilling its purpose?
Well, yeah, thank you for the question, Kimberly. The better shelter, in a sense, is fulfilling its purpose, but I don't think its purpose is a very good one. I mean, the better shelter is designed to be a kind of transitional shelter between a tent and a house. So it's designed to last longer. A tent is designed to last 3 to 6 months. A better shelter is designed to last up to 3 years. And a house, of course, is designed to last much longer. So a better shelter is being used in places like Matamoros. And it's being used in several places in Mexico right now. And I think it will be used in many, now that the UNHCR is getting involved in sheltering migrants and refugees who can't cross the U.S. border. So there's going to be many more better shelters in Mexico and in the United States as well. The problem is, and this is, the transition from tent to house is not, it's not a question of duration, as I said, it's a question of rights. You need rights to have a house. You live in a tent when you don't have rights, or your rights are not recognized. And so a better shelter is being used in a way to turn a question about the recognition of rights into a question of duration, a question around permanence and impermanence. So it's actually, I think, fulfilling its job, but I don't think that job is a job worth doing.
Thank you. I have another question here. It says, public housing in the periphery of Ciudad Juárez is similar to refugee housing. That difference might be the materials. What that can tell us about architecture and architects in the border city?
That's a fascinating question to whoever asked it. Thank you for raising it.
Elisa Vasquez.
I would like that person to say more, because I think that's an extremely interesting, what this person is noticing is extremely interesting. So in other words, that not only are the kind of paradox of refugees being smoothed over by giving them better shelter that kind of looks like housing, but maybe the paradox of that faced by working class people in a place like Ciudad Juárez is being smoothed over by giving them housing that looks like a refugee camp. This question opens up so many fascinating issues. I wish we had more time to talk just about this. In the way that, because you know what, with so many interesting things here, because it also opens up to the way, you know, it would be interesting to know how many of those people living in those housing projects are themselves migrants or displaced people? Because cities across the world are now, especially in peripheral areas, are increasingly housing displaced people and migrant people, more of whom live in cities in substandard housing than live in refugee camps. And this is something that is happening a lot in the Middle East, where refugees who can't find camps to house themselves, or can't find places in cities to house themselves because they can't afford to find affordable places to rent, end up returning to refugee camps because it's the only place they can find to live. But much more could be said about this. It's a really interesting relationship.
I will read a little bit more of what she said. She says, I make me think about the kind of identity that architecture wants to produce or reproduce. I have another one. Stephen Cairns, Architecture and Migrancy, suggests we need to conceive in a new way the idea of resident in relation to house. Are you agree?
I think so, but I didn't read that book, so I don't know what his. Can that person?
Okay.
Yeah,
no.
I mean, we definitely, because in much of the planet, a house is a commodity, and the commodification of housing is rendering adequate housing unavailable to vast swaths of global humanity. So I agree, we need to decommodify housing first and foremost to change our relationship to it, for sure.
Thank you. I have here a question from Alejandro González Milea. It says, it seems to me that Daniel Nemser's work reminds us that a very big part of architectural history is a history of control and violence. Architecture becomes a violent artifact through history. Do you agree with this?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's also a crucial point. For those of us who teach in places like architecture schools, like I do and Alejandro does, these are professional schools that train students to become architects. And for so often, that training idealizes architecture. It presents architecture as a kind of beautiful thing for beautiful people that does beautiful things. And the way in which architecture participates in oppression, in exclusion, in dispossession, in violence, doesn't get addressed. And so students leave architecture school with a very idealized perspective on what architecture is and what architecture does. And I think if we were more, what's the right word? If we were more open about the ways in which architecture is complicated and architecture is used in terrible ways as well as beautiful ways, then I think we would educate students better, not worse. We would give them a more complete picture of architecture, and so they would be more equipped to go out into the world and be better architects. And I guess I would also say, I think, as someone who teaches the history and theory of architecture, I feel like maybe it's left to historians and theorists of architecture in schools of architecture to tell that other story, the story that I feel like is not often told in say, the studio.
Absolutely. Yes, I have here a comment from Andrew Marful, and he says, in Mexico, there are millions of refugees and expelled from Social Security. They are not accounted for, and many sell irregularly in Ciudad Juárez, an area of 100 million square meters has been allocated for them, but we don't see them. Did you know this?
I don't know. I know very little about Ciudad Juárez. I'm fascinated by it. I wish I could. I wish there wasn't a pandemic, so we could have done this in person, and I would have loved to learn more from you all. And I mean, I think you know what this question points. I did not know about this, but I think you know what this question shows is the ways in which the state is using practices and policies that emerge to manage refugees, to manage other undesirable populations of people, like these people this question is asking about. In other words, these practices and policies, like encampment, for example, emerge historically to manage displaced people like refugees, but then they evolve to manage all sorts of other populations that the state finds threatening or troubling. So yeah, I think that's a very interesting situation that this question is pointing to.
Thank you. One more left. Antonio Carrillo says, this sort of architecture has become an industry standard here in the border city. People have adopted the idea due to the fact that it's the only way one can afford home. So the industry pushes them to adopt these kind of spaces, very much like the refugee camp. These spaces represent a safe space, like you were saying. Does the lack of options promote the growing problem of adequate housing? And does this have anything to do with education and being informed citizens?
Yeah, that's also a wonderful question. I think it has everything to do with lack of options. You know, one of the things that's very striking to me in the case of the better shelter, and this question also points to, is how things like safety or dignity, these are feelings, safety, dignity, protection. They become substitutes for rights that the state does not recognize. But they're incomplete substitutes. And again, I think what people really want is people want to. People can't live a feeling of safety that you get from a shelter with semi-transparent walls and a door that locks cannot substitute for having your rights as a human being recognized.
Well, thank you, Andrew. I am very excited to be here and to listen to you, to all you have to say about this subject, which is, I repeat, very urgent to know and to talk about. So thank you very much for sharing your experience and your knowledge about this. We hope when everything ends, the pandemic, you are very welcome to come here, and we can give you a tour so you can, I don't know, get information and data for your next work.
Thank you, Elisa, for moderating this, and thank you, all of you who are here, thank you for your attention. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and your questions and your perspective with me. As I said, I'm honored to be with you, and I'm humbled to be with you. And I hope that one day we can be together in person. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew, for your time. And well, it's time to say goodbye. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And have everyone a nice day.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Andrew. Bueno, pues ya damos por terminada esta cátedra magistral de Andrew Herscher de la Universidad de Michigan y pues nos vemos en los siguientes eventos. Gracias.